well, it was an open letter, but did you get any response from the U.S. Congress on these contradictions?
No, and one reason for writing this book was I know that people, both in politics and in the media, are nervous, as an understatement, to deal with conspiracy theories. Of course, they won't call the main, the official story a conspiracy theory. They just use it one-sidedly for us. But that's the way the term is used. So they don't dare show the slightest bit of sympathy for a, quote, conspiracy theory, or they get labeled as a kook and lose their credibility. So in this book, I don't have any theory. So there's no conspiracy theory. There's no argument. There's just laying out 25 facts that say Norman Mineta says this, Dick Cheney says this, or Richard Clark said this, and General Myers said this. And these were big things, like where were they that morning? And so they were just facts that could be reported without any endorsement of any theory, and yet not a single member of Congress, we sent it to almost all members of Congress, not a single member did anything about it. Only 3 of them even acknowledged, gave thanks, had secretaries give thanks for sending the book. And not a single person in the press reported on the book in the mainstream press or picked up any of the contradictions, where I've done their work for them, and yet they won't use it.
Are we not living in some kind of Spanish, well, I shouldn't use the term Spanish Inquisition, but it is an inquisitorial system because it establishes a line and it doesn't allow the truth to prevail. It's as if the lie should become the truth.
Well, that's right, and that's not a bad analogy, because one thing I had written about in the past was the witch craze of the 16th and 17th century, and it really was a craze that all you had to do was accuse somebody of being a witch, and they were a witch. And sometimes it was so grotesque, you had a test. You threw them in the water. If they floated, they were a witch, and so you burned them at the stake. If they sunk, they weren't a witch, and you say, oh, too bad, she wasn't really a witch.
Okay.
But, and it's the same thing now. You just accuse somebody of being an outrageous conspiracy theorist. So now you just say, he's a truther. So it doesn't matter that, like you in your life in the past, were a world-class economist with a global reputation. But suddenly now, none of that counts. It's that you're a truther. And so the idea is that first you were a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, and then you went out and dug up all these facts, where, of course, we know the truth is the opposite. You, like me, I assume, at least I originally believed the official story, did for a year and a half, until I actually looked at the evidence. It was the evidence that won me over. But they reverse it and say, he's a truther, therefore this is what he believes, so you shouldn't believe anything he says because he's a truther, and truthers lie. They make things up.
Yeah, well, in essence, that was the way the Inquisition functioned, because it
exactly.
wasn't. And I should say it was the Spanish and the French Inquisition, and it lasted for several hundred years. That's something we don't often address. How long do you think this? Because if the lie actually is revealed, and if the consensus is broken, the whole construct collapses like a deck of cards. Do you think we're in for a long, long period of official lies, or will the truth prevail?
Well, it will prevail one of these days, but it may be far too late for it to do any good. And then people will look back and say, oh, it's too bad that 9/11 Truth Movement, they were so ineffective. If they had had some really bright, competent people, they could have gotten the truth out. We could do it, so they could have, and so that's the way it may turn out. But by the way, this witch craze was also big in England and in New England, and so America has experience with this, and I thank you for that analogy. I think I will use it in the future to point out that the same kind of dynamic goes on here that went on the witch craze, which is now totally discredited, and yet they're using exactly the same methods now.
Yeah, and it also is used to go after the so-called terrorists. In other words, and it becomes a racist ideology because certain categories of people are targeted as potential terrorists, and consequently they are blacklisted, and it's an inquisitorial witch hunt which is taking place.
Yes, they set up many kinds of proof that there were Muslim terrorists on those flights. There are about 12 different kinds of, let's just say 10 different kinds of evidence they give. You know, that they found passports at the scene, and so on. But I think for most people, the big one was the phone calls. And this is one thing that you dealt with early on. Two of you Canadians did, you and Key Dudney. And since then, we've even gotten more proof that the cell phone calls could not have happened. They had to have been fake. And now even the FBI admits this. That is, that there were no high-altitude cell phone calls. Well, what do we do with Dina Burnett, who says, I know it was my husband Tom calling me from Flight 93 because I looked on my caller ID and there was his cell phone number. You can't just say, well, you know, she made a mistake or she misheard or something like that, or she lied. Why in the world would she lie? But now the FBI, on their official report that they put out at the Moussaoui trial in 2006, said, oh, no, Tom called her on a seatback phone. And then when they get to Barbara Olson, the most famous of all the phone calls, the one that told us, the only one that told us that the hijackers had box cutters, why, now the FBI says that call didn't happen, those calls didn't happen at all. Ted Olson had reported he got 2 calls from her that morning. Each one lasted about a minute. She told him the plane, Flight 77, had been taken over by hijackers with knives and box cutters, and so on. And this was reported on CNN, and this was a major factor in getting the so-called war on terror started, because these evil, murderous Muslim hijackers had killed sweet Barbara Olson, who was a very well-known commentator on CNN. Well, we learned that Flight 77 did not have seatback phones. On the American 757s did not. And likewise, the FBI came to agree that these high-altitude cell phone calls couldn't have occurred. Ted said he was uncertain whether she was calling on a cell or seatback phone, and he oscillated. But then the FBI realized, oh, she couldn't have called either way. So now they just say, Barbara Olson attempted one call. It was unconnected. Therefore, it lasted 0 seconds. So here you have the FBI itself saying the most famous of all the stories about a cell phone call, or a phone call from the planes reporting Muslim hijackers, it didn't happen. And yet the press will not report that.
Yeah, this is all very disturbing because if I recall, one of the first chapters of the 9/11 Commission report was what happened on the planes. And it was largely based on cell phone conversations. And as you say, you can't place a call from 31,000 feet. Impossible. I checked the flight records and timing and so on. Some of those calls could have been placed at very low altitude, but most of them, according to the timeline, were placed at high altitude. And consequently, as you suggest, that whole chapter, which is fundamental to the 9/11 Commission report, was fabricated.